Next, we would like to welcome Desiree Fixler, an advocate for change and impact in the practice of ESG investing and sustainability. She's the chair of the board of Venture ESG, works as a senior advisor to financial institutions, and is a frequent media commentator on ESG matters. In her career spanning over 20 years, Fixler has held senior roles at companies such as JP Morgan, Deutsche Bank, Zeiss Group, and DWS Group. As a sustainability officer at DWS Group, she exposed what she considered to be extensive greenwashing. She says, the recent set of US and German regulatory and enforcement actions is the biggest deterrent of greenwashing. It's the real wake-up call for all corporate executives to back up their ESG statements and products with action and data.
Hello, dear ECEC guests. I'm glad to be here. My name is Thomas Krick. I'm the Managing Director for ESG Solutions here at EQS Group. And I'm pleased to welcome Desiree. So excited to have you. I've been following your work for a really long time, and it's a great honor to speak. So thanks for coming.
Thank you very much for having me.
Great. So there's so many things we could discuss. We could discuss the state of sustainable investing, connecting to Jerome's earlier speech, greenwashing in and outside of the finance industry, as well as your experience as someone who speaks up against greenwashing, who's spoken up against greenwashing. And ideally, we'll cover all of that a bit. But let's start with sustainable investing. We've seen a massive increase of financial products and assets under management that are somehow denominated as ESG, sustainable impact. So I think Achim earlier mentioned $41 trillion US. That's a big number. So kind of all heading the right way on the quantitative side. But what do we make of the quality of this? In your view, how has the way that financial market participants, investors, lenders, the way they consider sustainability and ESG factors in what they do, how has that changed over the last years? And is it heading in the right direction?
So the last year has been very challenging. There's no doubt there's been a little bit of a retreat, and thankfully so. There was a influence that COVID had created, mobilizing the trillions into largely green strategies, ESG integration strategies. But that sort of green bubble was certainly popped in the last year due to a number of factors. You mentioned regulatory investment enforcement actions, clamping down against greenwashing. And then, of course, obviously, the macroeconomic and political headwinds that we've encountered recently. And that's questioned ESG investment, financial performance, and also financial compliance. But I do see this as actually correction. I mean, it's a bit akin to the bubble. I think it was Warren Buffett who said, only when the tide goes out, you learn who's been swimming naked. And I think I'm actually quite positive on this now. It kind of looks similar, but it's not. I think that we're going to separate kind of real actors from fake actors. I think sustainable investing will emerge from this struggle. And, the biggest thing to support this is the monumental in the US. We've just seen with the passing of the Inflation Reduction Act, I mean, the greatest climate action legislation in the US.
Okay, great. Short message to the studio. I have a bit of trouble understanding Desiree, quite a bit of trouble. Is there something we can do? Okay, we're going to have to work with it. I can catch about 70% of what you're saying. There's a bit of distortion here on my side. So if I look a bit puzzled, please don't worry. So you mentioned extensive and very ambitious legislation in the US. that's really driving this, really driving financial markets as well. And I think that's great news. And how do you see that impacting particularly companies in the real economy as well? I mean, we've been talking a lot about the finance industry, and naturally they're expected to also channel a lot of this money. But what is the potential change you see in the real economy?
Very positive. Companies were pressured to make bold statements, net zero, and it got to a situation where companies were almost one-upping each other on who would, get to net zero before the other one, and that was irrational. Companies were also bombarded with too many sustainable reporting requirements. Sorry, I'm not sure if you're hearing me.
No, I am. Companies are bombarded with too many sustainability requirements.
Okay. And so we had this, companies were confronted with so many different reporting guidelines, TCFD, SASB, GRI, and that was unfair to companies that I do believe majority of companies want to do the right thing. They do have long-term sustainability goals, right? That coincides with financial performance. But it was massively confusing, time-consuming, and expensive. And I think what's happened now with this like bubble bursting and finally more sensible approaches to ESG is that we have the rise of ISSB, which is finally going to standardize. It's of course single materiality, but company reporting standards, disclosure requirements, and I think that's massively that makes things so much simpler for companies to transparently communicate to investors. It also makes the selection for investors much easier, just to be able to have one baseline to compare companies on their sustainability profiles. So this, I believe, will be mandated by regulators. But I think at the end of the day, this is a very positive outcome for companies.
Okay, great. Yep. So positive developments on the legislative front in terms of financing packages, not just legislation, but also just government action, particularly in the US. In the EU, we see massive, a grand master plan to finance the transformation towards a sustainable economy. Now, standardization on the sustainability reporting front. Do you see these developments also as antidotes to, for example, the kind of practices that you criticized at DWS and that have since been picked up in a lot of other companies, or at least been suspected and are being investigated in other asset management firms? These misrepresentations. I mean, my personal view is I don't think this is all totally intentional. There's a mix of factors that lead to these kinds of situations where things are being said that aren't necessarily totally corresponding to the spirit of sustainability and the full intention. Do you think these developments that you describe are going to make a difference to that tendency and frequency of misrepresentation?
Yes, it will. I think what has happened is the wake-up call for companies to understand, this is real economy financial services, that we have to be as evidence-based and substantiate all non-financial disclosure. I think that these investigations have educated so many corporate executives about that there's a difference between an aspirational statement and a financially material statement. And that, right, these days, sustainability drives a big portion of a company's business. And you have to be as painfully accurate about your non-financial disclosure as you do with your financial disclosure. And I think companies get that. The sustainability officer or the sustainability office should not sit in the marketing department. The role of the officer in office has evolved. It should be thought of as a risk management job, a compliance job, and that the sustainability office has to comply with the rigors of regular way financial reporting. And that is a positive. And again, it makes it easier for companies. And I think that these investigations, that while they might have been somewhat awful for the companies experiencing it, it's led to, I think it's raised the bar on practice.
Yep. Interesting, thank you. So you already mentioned a number of things that companies should, I guess, kind of do differently in order to take things more seriously. You mentioned treating sustainability as a compliance challenge, not having it sit in the marketing department. Can you say a bit more about that? What do you feel are the kind of hallmarks of a company that is really taking sustainability seriously and really walking the talk?
This is a long-term commitment. So the best thing a company can do is understand it takes investment and acknowledge you don't have to come up with such large statements about bold actions and commitments. You know, understand that aspiration is different from action. Today, people want to hear about action. They want to hear about outcomes. They've tired of all of these net zero commitments and pledges. You know, while seeing, I mean, the biggest marker of success is looking at global carbon emissions, and we're not succeeding there. Emissions are going up. Folks know that. So I think that that's the most important thing, is to be sensible about your communication. This isn't a win-win. It's not a slam dunk where, you know, you come out with statements, ESG or sustainability is in our corporate DNA. Diversity and inclusion is our top priority. You know, we're taking serious climate action. I think instead, just dial down the rhetoric, but then dial up the action. And I do have some like practical, you know, tips. Number one, right, ensure your ESG approach, your ambitions, your strategies are aligned firm-wide. The ESG or sustainability group shouldn't sit as an island unto itself, right? These are principles that all divisions, all folks, you know, need to live. It's kind of akin, I see, to like adapting to, you know, normal, like, you know, regulation, MiFID II adoption, or Dodd-Frank in the States, right? This has to be enterprise-wide. So the organizational setup and governance around sustainability is extremely important. You need to ensure that there's board responsibility. And as I just mentioned, all divisions are operating and aligned with the same principles and ambition. The second piece of advice is just on disclosure. We know this is still a nascent market and that many terms, many strategies are not clearly defined. So it is incumbent on companies to define them themselves, right? So disclosure, clear communication. When you're using any sort of sustainability or ESG terms, define what you mean by them, right? Ensure that you're also defining what your strategies or objectives or metrics mean. Ensure that you're disclosing what data you're using and how you aggregate that. That is very, very important. And, Thomas, as you said, make sure at the end of the day, you're going to walk the talk, right? Don't espouse principles for your products and services that you're selling that you yourself don't live. So ensure, right, that you're aligned with, again, with what you're selling.
Yeah, thanks. And this makes me think of what Jerome said earlier. So there's walk and there's talk. There's a lot of talk, and as you said, a lot of rhetoric. Maybe sometimes it might be better to dial that down and focus on the doing and on the actual action, and whatever is communicated, that it aligns with that action, indeed. Now, the way we've been talking about it, even in our conversation, and generally this is a compliance conference, yeah, ethics, responsibility, all of these things sound pretty heavy and burdensome. And also when we look into the public debate now, particularly amongst companies, I personally hear people approaching this as something that is a lot about risk mitigation, a lot about compliance, and yes, it needs the rigor of compliance, but is there only a downside that materializes if you don't do this well, or is there also an upside if you make real progress on this sustainability and ESG stuff? What's your view on that?
Yeah, absolutely. There's an upside. I mean, the U.S. just pumped in almost $400 billion, right? A combination of funding and tax credits, true incentives to transition the U.S. economy. So, of course, there's tremendous opportunity here. There's tremendous opportunity in clean technology and clean energy. And of course, just overall best practice. I mean, that's what, folks want at the end of the day. They want clear communication. They want authenticity. And so I think that as we see clear guardrails and guidelines from regulators, from governments, that makes it easier, right? For a company to understand what's expected to report out to, their customers, their shareholders, their investors, and I think, right? I think we all know, right, that there's new product, growth. There is a tremendous economic transition. So it's everything that you as a company, right, to better communicate with your investors about, the principles and the full description of your products and services that you're offering, as well as, pushing into, technological innovation. There's absolutely tremendous opportunity.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, the way I sometimes like to look at it is that these social and environmental trends, they really shape markets. I think some of what you've been describing, the massive investment package in the US, that's also creating a degree of certainty. I mean, some of the things that has held back the energy transition is the fact that energy companies were going like, well, these are really long-term investments and we're not sure whether the regulatory context is going to support them over the long term. I think we have more certainty with that, with the whole geopolitical environment. And ultimately, these are both social and environmental forces that are shaping markets. And there are companies, and I think this is where I see also the risk of purely a compliance approach that are just reactive. They will always be on the back foot. And they run the risk of at some point being outdated in terms of their products, their services, their business practices. And those proactive companies that, potentially take a step ahead earlier, they have a much better chance of building a portfolio of really sustainable product, services, and operations, and that can ultimately have great impacts on upside revenues, on pricing power, and generally give you a leg up in the market. So much to kind of that macro thing of the progress towards sustainability in the economy. I'd love to talk a bit more with you about the whistleblowing in itself and speaking up. I mean, what you did at DWS wasn't whistleblowing in the strict sense. It was really rather more plain speaking out internally against malpractices that you perceived, and you saying we should be doing this differently, demanding change. And shortly after, you were terminated from your position, and you and DWS are still involved in legal proceedings. So it's fair to say that speaking up has resulted in some very significant consequences for you. Now, we don't want to dwell much on the legal proceedings here, but I do wonder, after this experience, you spoke up, you were terminated. What is your advice to employees in companies that see things they deeply disagree with? It might be in regards to sustainability and communications. It might be in regards to other things, integrity, conduct amongst colleagues, diversity questions. Would you recommend to people to also speak up, to blow the whistle? And if so, how should they approach it, and what should they be prepared for?
Absolutely. That is, I mean, at the end of the day, I think, right, to use that James Carville expression or a twist on it, right, it's governance, stupid, right? That's the most important thing, is good governance. And when you're operating in sustainability or ESG, the G is the most important thing. I mean, you cannot work in sustainability and not speak up if you're seeing something, going wrong. I mean, look, we operate in the real world. At any given time, like at a big company, someone's doing something stupid. It's inevitable, right? And it's human nature. And some of these things are by mistake, some things are intentional. And it's incumbent on senior officers and certainly part of the sustainability office to call things out. And what I
can still hear you.
Okay. No one's speaking German. It's okay. I think there's also audio issues. In any event, I think that what has happened with my story, I think give other people cover. It's a cautionary tale for companies not to go after folks that speak up internally. We're there, right, to protect the company. We're there to strengthen the company, right? We are the corporate crusaders, right? And, if you have insecure management, right, that goes after people that out some bad practice in the firm, they're the ones that should be ousted. And, the DWS tale is just that, right? And I mean, I have no legal actions. It's all on their side. They're under, a lot of investigation, and that's, that's just it. It's incumbent for companies, for management boards to listen if there is, a real issue, right? I don't want a world where there are witch hunts everywhere. Don't get me wrong, but when an issue is data or evidence-based, management must listen. And it is incumbent on us, as employees, right, to try and rectify things that aren't exactly on the right path. And I think today, with more and more people speaking up and reinventing themselves, right? I'm still active. I'm still part of the market. I'm in the mix. In a way, I have a more fascinating, more challenging and interesting career today. And so that's the message I would say, is that make sure that there's evidence behind it, right? There's you're not just, it's not a he said, she said thing, right? But raise these issues because, that's how a company evolves. And with the right management, they will listen.
Great, thank you. Now, speaking of the right management, you said, if there are claims being brought, if there are complaints, management should listen up, should be receptive, should look at the evidence, take it seriously. Are there things, if we perceive a speaking up culture also as a kind of inoculation against things going wrong in an organization and running off track, is there something that executives, company boards, maybe other entities could do proactively to really nurture that culture, to put people into a situation where they feel, actually, this is a place where I can really voice my opinion without fear of retribution.
Absolutely, but that is the definition of good governance and good company culture. Do that either to create a safe environment or, right, to have, whistleblower hotlines and, attentive auditing and compliance departments. Also what's important is sometimes, right, issues, I've sat on reputational risk committees and, I've been part of, executive management, right? And there are small issues and there are big issues. And, when you have, a big issue that might be more than just a one-off fat finger issue, it's important also to get third-party investigators in, right? Legitimate forensic folks and legal folks in, right? To really, find out what's happened there. So, I think, it's being sensible, as a corporate leader, both to create an environment where folks feel that they can, speak up, in an appropriate manner, right? And then secondly, if there is an issue, make sure you bring in, independent investigators to find out what exactly happened.
Yep, and I mean, we see that a lot now also with governments enforcing the bringing in of these independent investigators. On the kind of encouraging side, what I must say, I kind of like to see when we have corporate leaders that also themselves openly admit that things are not always running smoothly, that admit failure, that admit miscommunications, and I think partly that's where it starts. Yeah? If you cultivate this culture of everything needs to be perfect, our company is perfect, we're all perfect, we're not making any mistakes, then you're not creating that sphere of psychological safety where people can actually go and also tell somebody else that maybe something they're doing is wrong. There's no openness to that.
Yeah, there's a great quote by the former CEO of Goldman Sachs, Lloyd Blankfein, who has said, the best traders are not right more than they're wrong. They're simply quick adjusters. They're better at getting right when they're wrong. And I think that was it was just such a great quote. And it's exactly that look, we're all human, we make mistakes, organizations, sometimes things go off track, and that's okay. The most important thing is market to market, right? Don't deny it, don't cover it up, right? And sometimes you just have to say, like, yeah, look, we were well intentioned, but we didn't get the outcome what we wanted, but we're fixing it and we're going to move on.
It reminds me of this term due diligence, that it's actually not used in the FSI space so much, I feel, at least not in this responsible investing space, but I now lead a lot of conversations around how do you implement supply chain due diligence laws in companies, and how do you execute them in companies, and I'm always in the same conversation where people are like, well, somebody's got to know, right? There's this law now, there's a European directive coming. There have been relatively weak laws on a number of European companies. There's now new stuff in the US as well. And what I always notice is, well, really, these are all pretty new practices. And not a lot of companies have been comprehensively trying to green their supply chains, to eradicate or combat human rights. And there's a lot of testing to be done, and there will be a lot of mistakes made. And I guess partly what we're seeing in the responsible investing space follows the same tack. And as you say, we haven't made so great progress, or barely any really, for example, on the all-important carbon agenda. So let's maybe return to that for a moment and talk about carbon and carbon reporting and the money that's going into it. There's a lot of focus on targets over the last years. Yeah, net zero targets, overall decarbonization targets, so-called science-based targets, which means that companies basically figure out what is my relative share that I have to make in my industry, given the size of my company, the size of my operations, to make my contribution to achieving this 1.5 degree Celsius target we've all agreed in Paris. Most companies now have these targets, but what do you think of actual progress towards them? A lot of them are pretty far out, 2030, 2050. They're sometimes made by people who may not be around by the time they get checked. What do you see here? And is the legislation maybe making a difference here?
I think it will. I think, the first step is to have baseline disclosure requirements for all companies, right? And, Europe is coming out with their disclosure requirements, and the SEC has a climate risk disclosure proposal in the hopper. You have the ISSB, right, trying to standardize it to create one international set of sustainability disclosure requirements. I think that is the first step, right? Just to have companies report out. I think scope 1 and 2 is pretty well defined. Scope 3 needs more definition, and that's what hopefully, ISSB and regulators globally will do. That is the first step. As far as net zero pledges, look, some companies have come out with credible action plans, but a lot of companies have not. They've signed up to certain pledges, and we all know you can kick the can. The UN has an organization, Race to Zero, that is trying to create more structure around interim targets and action plans and policies. Let's see if that is voluntarily accepted. I personally don't think so. I think there's going to be pushback. The starting point is, again, let's just get companies to report out so investors can make more informed decisions how they want to invest, right? And let's progress from there.
So in a way, you're saying that, well, first thing, we need to, get the transparency, get the clarity into actual performance, into targets, make them accessible. And then we at least have a starting situation where we can really hold companies to account. There are settings where you say some companies have good plans to reach those declared targets, and in some places they might be a little shaky. My personal views, I think, and some of those companies that have these targets without plans, they're taking it in an optimistic bet that markets will align, we'll find our way, and still doing it in good faith, I think. Others are potentially a bit more reckless and just felt, well, I was asked for a target, here it is. So interesting. I do hope that the new investment budgets unleashed in the US are also going to make it easier for companies to prepare the ground and to facilitate successful investments into these I guess transformation of infrastructure, of corporate operations, so on and so forth. I've read an article in the FT a couple of days ago, where the FT was expressing its view, was an author in the FT expressing its view that with that legislative package, the US has effectively taken the baton of greening and sustainable transformation from Europe. Now, we're here at the primarily European conference. You're in the US, you're seeing this development. We used to be, I think Europeans have a habit of walking around and thinking that, we know how lots of things should work. But when you now look from the US, well, I know you're actually now based in the UK, right? But originally from New York. With your American hat on, looking to Europe, are there things that we can learn here in terms of how we approach this, potentially on the political space or also in the corporate sphere?
Look, Europe has certainly led on the sustainability agenda. There's no doubt. I think both regimes can learn from each other. The U.S. is very focused. They're very, very different. The U.S. is very focused on disclosure requirements, right? The SEC sees its role as it's a regulator to protect investors and to ensure we have market stability, right? In Europe, the approach is different. It is to mobilize private capital into sustainable investments. Right, the U.S. focuses more on single materiality, right? It looks at, forcing companies to disclose their enterprise value risk from climate change, right? Europe wants both enterprise value risk plus calculation of negative externalities, the impact of their products and services on society. The U.S., might get there in the future, right? There's more learning about, impact. But what Europe can learn from the US is greater enforcement. And what the US does well is that it has clear sets of rules, and then it has a big apparatus to supervise and enforce, right? And because it's clear, folks working at the variety of authorities, of regulatory bodies understand. A large, number of them come from, the financial services sector. I think that's where Europe can do a better job, is that sometimes Europe goes a little bit too much into the weeds and is a little bit too prescriptive on what investors are supposed to be doing. There is, a lot of pushback on SFDR and the taxonomy, that it's very burdensome, it's unclear, it's very ambiguous, it gives rise and might even be enabling certain forms of greenwashing. It was well-intentioned, but again, a little bit vague. And so that gives people scope to feel comfortable to not be as accurate in their non-financial reporting. I think that the Bundeskriminalamt, the BKA in Germany, did more to deter greenwashing than all of SFDR and the taxonomy and all of the motherload of regulation from the European Union's Sustainable Finance Action Plan. Because at the end of the day, you have to hit it top level. People, right, you can't exploit sustainability to raise money or to improve your PR profile, right? You have to do it, exactly. And, nothing raises the bar of good practice, like the bar on good practice on Wall Street, more than an enforcement action. When the regulator takes action and fines a firm or sends folks to jail on securities fraud, everyone wakes up. Trust me, Wall Street pre-Dodd-Frank and post-Dodd-Frank is not the same. And I think that that's what Europe has to do to be better at, simplifying regulation and ensuring that practitioners know that they're being watched. That's what will make people second guess greenwashing at a top level and make sure that they're delivering on what they're saying they're doing, delivering on their pledges.
Very interesting. Thank you. Very interesting insights, I think, also as a context to the debates we're having here about that burden of regulation. Desiree, we're at the end of our time. Could have talked for hours. It's been really enjoyable and interesting. Thanks so much for your time. And I look forward to speaking in future.
Likewise. Thank you.